Hello, everybody. My name is David Brear, and welcome to episode 3 of the 11 Newsroom. In this weekly show, we take a deep dive into the biggest news story of the week that's just gone. What we want to do is try and figure out what the story means for the industry, who will be impacted, who will benefit from what might the change come along to be, and really what will the industry do to go forward from there. So this episode of 11FS Newsroom is brought to you by Radar Payments, who are connecting payments to the commerce worldwide. Radar Payments, if you guys don't know, take out the complexity of the payments space to let banks, neobanks, PSPs, and fintechs solely focus on delivering a frictionless customer experience. The white label one-stop shop lets you issue payments instruments, accept the widest range of payments methods online, in-store, in-app, in over 100 currencies, and allows you to really put your brand at the forefront of what you're doing. To find out more about this, if you visit www.radarpayments.com, you'll be able to find out a lot more. So on today's show, what we're going to be doing is talking about the FCA's Digital Sandbox initiative. Before we get into it, I want to just cover a few things to recap on really what's been announced this week. Firstly, the FCA have opened application windows for not one, but 2 sandbox services to support innovative firms tackling challenges caused by the pandemic. The 2 sandboxes are Cohort 7 of the Regulatory Sandbox and a pilot of a new Digital Sandbox initiative. The Digital Sandbox pilot particularly is going to be aiming at earlier stage innovations where products and solutions are more in early development and not at the stage yet where they're ready to be really sort of tested on consumers or in a live production environment, which is going to be really, really interesting to impact and understand. To find out a little bit more about this week, we're going to be joined by Francesca Hopwood-Road, who is the head of Regtech and Advanced Analytics at the FCA. Francesca, lovely to have you on here. I always say, like, one of the best titles ever. Like, if you're going to be head of Regtech anywhere, like being head of Regtech at the most progressive regulator on the planet is a pretty decent place to start, isn't it? So how are you doing anyway? Lovely to have you on again.
I'm very well, and thank you for such a warm welcome. It is, I have to say, it is hand on heart. It is such a privilege and a pleasure to do the job that I am doing, because as you say, it's a hugely progressive space. There's a lot going on. I think the thing we're going to talk about today, the Digital Sandbox pilot, is a kind of the most recent exemplar of that, but by certainly not the only one. So yeah, I count myself very lucky indeed. Yes.
As always, guys, anybody who's watching this out there, and we know there's lots of you, which is great, then we love getting your questions as we go through the show. If you have any comments, have any questions, chuck them into the sidebar, and the producers of the show will weave them in for us to make sure that we answer them live for you today. Francesca, before we sort of get into the sandboxes, tell us a little bit more about the background to your role and actually what sort of brought you to be working at the FCA in the first place.
If I take the first bit and then and I'll delve into a little bit of my history. So my role, it does what it says on the tin. So I head up our Regtech program of activity, and I also head up our supervisory tech program of activity. Covers is a lot of the work that your listeners and your readers and your watchers will know around our tech sprint activity, really kind of which started off about five or so years ago with the 7 tech sprints we've done to really kind of catalyze, convene, shine a light on the kind of the potential we see that Regtech has to offer. And I think we'll talk about a little bit about that in more detail. And in the last couple of years, that space has really broadened out, and part of that has been driven by what we learned about Regtech and what we understood about Regtech, to see where we could start to seed some of those ideas and that art of the possible into what we could do from a supervisory technology point of view. So how could we learn the lessons from that tech, those approaches, to see what we could do to drive greater automation, greater prediction, greater insight and understanding from our own shop, if I can put it like that. So as a department, as an area of focus in the FCA, we're sort of, about 2 years old, although obviously we have a longer legacy with the Regtech work. And really what we're starting to see, and particularly with some of the work we're doing with GFIN, is really some of that cross-fertilization between Regtech and SupTech starting to flourish on a more global scale, which is really exciting. And I suppose a little bit about me. I think I have to call myself a regulator now. I've been a regulator for about 9 years, so I think I have to say I'm a regulator. I have not always been a regulator. I started my career actually in social policy, so I was really interested to understand kind of how policy and policy development could meet the needs of particularly excluded groups. So my background was working around vulnerable adults, whether that's mental health, learning disabilities, domestic violence, asylum and immigration. And then I really started focusing on the sort of financial services element of that as a way of supporting those excluded groups to kind of really engage with service provision. And so I worked in the third sector, the private sector, and then my path crossed with a regulator, and it made natural sense to work there. And then over the last few years at the regulator, I've really built kind of my experience around the importance of kind of connecting and joining up data and insight to really think about how we meet the needs of consumers, so our real consumer protection objective. And then that brought me to this role, and as you said, it's one of the neatest roles, right? So it was an opportunity too good to not throw my hat in the ring for. So I've been in this role for about a year now.
That's amazing, and a really interesting sort of progression of that as well, because if you're looking at making an impact in those areas, financial services plays such a massive part in connecting those dots and solving some of those problems, doesn't it? So, and I think that's something that people often don't understand about the regulators. Particularly, they look at anti-money laundering purely as a financial thing, not as the impact that has on millions of people's lives when those things are not addressed. So, you can do so much good from a planetary perspective by addressing some of these things from a regulatory perspective, can't you? Which is amazing. But anyway, we'll get into that one in another show, because I think there's so much we can sort of unpack on that. But tell us a little bit more about the digital sandbox then, because I think it's a really interesting thing. We've obviously seen as you say, the regulatory sandbox has been around for a little while now. You've got different cohorts coming through that. We've seen some really successful companies go on to do really amazing things kind of off the back of that. But the new digital sandbox for smaller companies, tell us a little bit about why that came about and really what you're trying to aim at.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is it's not necessarily focused on smaller companies. I think it's about focusing on a slightly different point in the evolution of a new offering or proposition. And what that insight has come from is our experience with the Regulatory Sandbox, but it's also experience with our tech sprints. And one of the things that we were sort of seeing with particularly propositions that were developed through our tech sprint environments was then how they make that leap from proof of concept through to proof of value. And we were seeing, and our hypothesis, and I think this is what's quite exciting about this pilot, is the hypothesis we want to test is we think there is a gap there. There is a gap for smaller companies or incumbents who have an idea or a proposition they want to test. They don't necessarily have the data. They don't necessarily have the platforms to collaborate and experiment, to demonstrate and to share what that proposition looks like for scrutiny, for engagement, as I said, for collaboration. And so what we are looking to test with the digital sandbox is really kind of how can we meet that need earlier on in that kind of innovation life cycle. And one of the things I think would be really keen actually to explore through this pilot process is our hypothesis that needs to be met. Is that correct? What can we learn? What can incumbents kind of benefit from this digital sandbox? Is it something that's useful for them? Because one of the things we want to explore is create a collaboration environment, a platform for incumbents to view and scrutinize and sort of poke and prod out propositions to come through, because some of the feedback that we have heard over the years is actually that's a bit of a gap for them at the moment, a kind of a marketplace to kind of see and explore and validate what that proposition might mean for them as part of their wider business offering. So we've wanted to bring this forward. It's obviously been accelerated by COVID and what we have seen for all of us over the last 6 months. But we're excited to bring it forward because we think as a minimum viable kind of proposition, we want to seek feedback. We want to get, gauge kind of feedback from collaborators, academics, participants, to say, okay, this is the hypothesis that we're putting out there. Is this correct? What can we learn?
I know that's really interesting because, as you say, particularly in a big incumbent organizational environment, then if you spend a lot of time, effort and money into something that actually you get really far down the line with, I mean, that's a road to, really spending more money than you need to in order to understand whether you can test something, or even logistically whether something can work in the way that you really want it to do. And I know, particularly in a digital world, the balance between advice and guidance is always one in a digital manifestation that is always like a hot topic, with not just in retail banking but wealth and commercial and various different angles. But I mean, is there any particular areas that you're wanting people to focus on for this first run of it? Because I mean, I guess, and this is really, if I'm honest with you, the thing that I've always found really great about how you've run these processes is you're not saying, look, we haven't spent 3 years working out this process. We're really setting this up as a way to test and learn the process, as well as testing and learning, and as you say, getting feedback from the people who are going through it. But have you identified any particular areas that you want people to focus on?
So yes, I think from it looks like my connection is really dodgy, so it looks like my face is really pixelated. So I hope you can still hear my voice. But there are three key areas that we want to test. There are three use cases that we would really like people participants to engage with, and that's around consumer vulnerability, fraud and scams, and SME lending. And the reason why we have chosen those three is clearly COVID has either made those more acute, or has kind of changed the dimension and lens on them. And what I mean by that is, clearly consumer vulnerability has always been a challenge. We know that there are, approximately 20 million consumers in the UK who have vulnerability characteristics. But what we also know is that COVID has either made the experience for those consumers more acute, or it has identified newly vulnerable groups of consumers and brought those to the fore. So, and we've seen with recent news in the press around scams and fraud that actually, unfortunately, and you'll know this from the work you did with us as a judge on the AML and financial crime tech sprint last year, people are very good at finding new opportunities to kind of to scam or defraud, and we are seeing that as well, kind of accelerating in a COVID environment. But I think it's also worth saying that across the three use cases, SME lending included, is that we expect these to persist beyond COVID. As I said, they are in and of themselves. We know that there are challenges there that we would really like to the digital sandbox as an environment to kind of delve into those in more detail. COVID has clearly accelerated and made that kind of more of a burning platform, but we very much see those use cases persisting beyond.
Yeah, it is sad, isn't it? As you say, sadly, with anywhere where there is a kind of a negative for a large group of people see that as an opportunity from a scams and a fraud perspective, don't they? So, and as you say, the fraudsters are pretty innovative in themselves in terms of how they go about these things. So, keeping a handle on all that. I mean, those three are really, they are the sort of hot topics of this period, as you say, in terms of the things that businesses or individuals are really being sort of hit with. I mean, what's in this? What's the flip side of this then? Because I think these are big industry problems that many individuals, many businesses are dealing with, but obviously from the companies that you're working with in terms of either the fintechs or the incumbents. I mean, the applicants are really struggling with these problems and how to kind of go about it. So what's the sort of experience that the applicants kind of get? What's your 30-second sort of experience pitch?
What are they going to get? I think so. There's a couple of things that I think I'd really like. There's 6 key features of the digital sandbox, but the 2 that I'd really like to pull out are the data. So one of the things that we know that makes a really successful tech sprint, and that we are always kind of spoken to afterwards by participating teams, is the data we make available for those teams to really kind of test their proposition, develop develop their proposition, and get that kind of scrutiny on their proposition. So the date and what we have built, and we did, and I'm a bit geekily excited by this, but we did a data sprint in the summer, 3-week data sprint. And what was a couple of things that were really profoundly interesting for us about that was the purpose of the data sprint was to build out the synthetic data to go into the digital sandbox. And you know, David, right? With a tech sprint, like kind of the heart of the tech sprint is competition. What we were doing with the data sprint was saying, kind of give us, this is for a public good. You know, there are no winners here. We're asking you to come together as professionals to collaborate and help us build out data sets to go into the digital sandbox. And hand on heart, I did have a few sleepless nights as to how many people would put their hand up and say, you know, we'd like to participate. We've got over 120 people participating over 3 weeks to build out those assets. Yeah. And when I talk about those assets, those are that's synthetic data assets, over 2 billion transactions with all the embedded typologies and behaviors. Across banking, across SME lending, across all these different domains, and so that data, that richness of that data, which is actually in excess of what we've provided for tech sprints before, I think is going to be one of the really valuable assets that participants are going to get. And we had a Regtech forum last week where we started to sort of demo some of the characteristics, and the feedback we were getting from participants on that call was really excited actually, and people were really kind of quite like, oh, actually this is good. And then the second thing is around the kind of collaboration platforms, and I think that goes to the kind of second hypothesis that we want to test. And I mentioned this earlier, which is we want to create a space where people can observe those propositions and sort of see what's coming, and have a kind of a technical space in which to, as I said, probe and ask questions and observe and see that experimentation. Offer up their services either as a subject matter expert or a mentor to help shape and enable those propositions develop. But I think crucially, in terms of catalyzing further change within the ecosystem, it's also a space for potential on the demand side to kind of start to interrogate and come forward and kind of say, well, you know, how is this proposition, might this meet a need that I'm currently experiencing, and what that might that look like, and create a marketplace, if you like, to start to interrogate in a bit more detail, you know, what that looks like, and create this kind of channels for conversation. We've also got API spaces. We've also got a kind of a development platform. So there are lots of exciting features, David. As I said, I could get incredibly geeky about it all, but I think those would be the two that I'd really pull out.
Well, these really are the things that make this successful, right? This isn't just a it's like throwing a party with no balloons and no cakes, right? You know, the data, this part is critical, as you say, to, and not just, you know, arbitrary data, but data that really is representative of the real world, because any model that's being put together really has to be sort of representative, doesn't it, in terms of actually what you're really going to see in the wild. So that's fantastic. I mean, I've always been really impressed with the particularly on the tech sprint side of things, the level of collaboration that you get through those as well. You get, you know, really big companies coming together, smaller innovative ideas, even from an academic innovation area side of things, particularly when we're talking about modeling out of these things. I mean, are you looking at, or are you expecting more sort of collaborative approaches to these innovations as well?
That's definitely something we aspire to, and I think that's one of the aspirations we've got with the pilot, and one of the things that we really. But I think we're also quite excited to see how that collaboration will manifest, and that might sound quite strange, but what we've hoped to do is create the environments and create the messages to say this is what we would like to see, and this is how we could see it working. And you know, we did round tables discussions, you know, in the run up to this. Clearly, we've got a track record, as you say, of delivering tech sprints, the regulatory sandbox. So we've kind of really lent into that depth of knowledge to kind of create these spaces. But I think it's then saying, how will colleagues respond? How will participants respond? How will they use these collaboration platforms? What will come? What will they kind of innovate off the back of this? And that's what's quite exciting to perceive. But if I can go back to the data sprint, we had academics, we had incumbents, we had data scientists, we had FCA data scientists in the mix as well, kind of bringing their expertise, and that level of collaboration. As I said, when there wasn't going to be a winner, you weren't going to be able to hold that little plastic gold trophy up and go, I got first prize. It was, and so to see that level of collaboration coming through on something that was virtual, not a sprint, more like a marathon, and a bit more esoteric in terms of creating synthetic data assets. That's a sort of a bit of a leap. So to see that already at that stage gives me a lot of excitement and confidence for what we will see hopefully coming forward with the pilot itself.
Well, it's definitely not just you. I think you've got a lot of people excited about it in the comments now as well. There's a lot of people getting excited about synthetic data development. Like it's a tough dinner conversation, isn't it, with your kids and your husband? But it definitely gets, from a community perspective, these are one of the real hot topics. So Jean Donnelly said, really excited to hear about the data sprint. Like I say, I think data geeks are kind of always very comfortable about just wearing it as a t-shirt and being like owning it as a thing. But do you think there are any additional technologies needed to aid that process of synthetic data development to make it easier for solutions needed within financial services? I mean, this is always if there was a magic wand for that, Francesca, we'd love to have it, wouldn't we? Because it's such a core, it's the blood through these things, isn't it?
Yeah. Look, I mean, would we do a data sprint again to create synthetic data assets at this scale? Questionable. I mean, we did it, and we did it with, as I said, phenomenal input. But it probably wasn't the most efficient way of doing it. But we have learned a huge amount, and we are definitely wanting to seek to iterate and build on that model, both in terms of what we can learn as a regulator from, having that capability and that at our disposal. What does that mean from the other side of my shop, from a supervisory technology point of view? That's fascinating. As an approach, as a thinking about how, from all the work that we, did last year around AML financial crime, clearly there are lots of linkages, and it is a fascinating space. I think one of the things that I'm quite interested in is how that can become replicable and scalable, so that we can continue to kind of furnish the community with synthetic data, because I think it is going to, for the reasons I've touched on, going to become an increasingly important part of propositions more generally.
Cool. And on you touched a little bit. I mean, collaboration across, obviously, in the tech sprints, it's a community, isn't it? But how much of that? And I've always been intrigued by this in terms of across the different cohorts that you've had in the past. I know you've had some of them talk to other ones to, make sure people know what they're doing and know what to expect. But community plays a big part in this and a lot of the things that you guys are doing at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what's going to be quite interesting, so there's a sort of a healthy competition piece, isn't there, around kind of the tech sprints and that, and that collaboration. And I think with each of the tech sprints we've done, we have learned lessons. So, the tech sprint we hosted last year, I mean, it was the first one we hosted in our offices. It did change the kind of nature of collaboration and engagement a bit more. So that we're constantly learning. I think one of the things that would be quite interesting about the digital sandbox is, we've talked about kind of small entrants, we've talked about incumbents. I'm really quite interested to see how incumbents use it and what they bring to the table and where they seek to kind of engage and seek to kind of bring their knowledge, maybe their ask to the table as well, actually, what their need is. And I'm really interested to see how that one plays out, because, we know from listening to the mood music over the last 6 months that, some incumbents are doubling down in their innovation space, others are not making those calls. So it will be quite interesting to see how the digital sandbox is used from that point of view.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, very often I've worked in a big incumbent bank in the past, and actually very often the regulator's name gets used reasonably in vain. That actually the regulator wouldn't allow that, or you can't do that because and it's like, do you know what? When you talk to the regulator, that's not the vibe. And actually, when your intention is around creating the best outcome for the consumer in terms of the things that you're looking to do, just because something didn't work in the past was probably more about how people did it than whether it was something that was allowed or capable or not, really. So I think this is the change, though, isn't it? Really, the FCA are now in the kickoff meeting for the innovation ideas that banks want to move forwards, rather than, and this is interesting, Francesca, with your two hats on in terms of your different worlds, supervisionary work and looking at what people have done, and the world that you sort of move towards in terms of helping them shape the ideas and shape the concepts to make sure what is being done is right in the first place. Like the world, the work you're doing in the innovation side and the sandbox side should be in the future making the rest of the supervisory work a lot more collaborative as well.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, because I think one of the things that we're seeking to do, particularly on the Regtech side, and as I said, we hosted this Regtech forum last week, is to create a space where we can have the conversations and to kind of enable those conversations. So to give a line of sight on the things that we are considering and contemplating as a regulator of things that are interesting, bring kind of that conversation to bear. For a broader range of regulatory colleagues, I think, and take it slightly out of the RegTech world within the organisation and broaden that out, and I think in lots of different ways, I think if you have innovation only in one space in an organisation, that does the whole organisation quite a disservice. And I think that the more that we can enable that conversation to flow, that insight, that understanding, that kind of excitement actually about how we can harness ideas and applications and capability, what that might mean for us, what we're seeing, where we're seeing peer regulators do things. All of that is a conversation that I think should be and could be broader.
I completely agree. And as you say, I mean, we said at the top of this, I mean, financial services is really the lifeblood of every industry and actually society much more broadly. So getting these changes right, and actually, I mean, these particular areas that you're focusing on are the problems that society is really facing, not just financial services is facing. So and the impact of solving those things has a really broad remit, broad impact, doesn't it? But I mean, what are you? I mean, ultimately, at the end of this, I mean, what do you think this will do for innovation in the market? Because, I mean, it feels like this can be such a catalyst.
So I think, I mean, it's such a big question, David. And I think, one of the things I think very practically is, we have a fervent hope, and we are doing this in collaboration with the City of London Corporation. We have a fervent hope that this is the start of this story. So yes, it's a pilot, but it's phase one. We are going to, as I said, we have a set of hypotheses we want to test. We're getting it independently evaluated so we can really understand the efficacy. What value does it bring? Where did we suppose that something would bring value, but actually it's not quite realized in the way we had intended? What unintended positive consequences have there been? We really want to unpack and understand that, and I think you'll know about the Khalifa review into fintech. We really want this to kind of feed in and be a kind of a key input to kind of the reflections and ruminations of that review. Because, as I said, we want this to be the start of the journey. We think, and creating this space for nationally for kind of for different parts of the ecosystem to use and engage with and ultimately benefit from this environment is key. It's worth saying that there is huge interest, as you would expect, from international regulators into what the Digital Sandbox represents. Colleagues on our Global Financial Innovation Network are obviously really interested, as are philanthropic organisations. There is significant potential utility for what this can bring. What we have sought to do is bring out kind of a minimum viable in a relatively short period of time, meeting an immediate need. and I'm sure the teams would say this as well, we need to also reflect on the huge lessons we've learned from building out the synthetic data. We need to really interrogate the lessons we get from the evaluation to understand, as I said, these are hypotheses we were seeking to test. What's the outcome been from that? What value have we achieved, and what have we learned? And then I think is that next piece of the conversation, and obviously City of London, a corporation, are intimately involved with this as well, which is about, so where to next, and what does that mean? But I think the critical part of that is to understand the value and benefit, hopefully, that this brings over the next few months as successful applicants start to bed in and use the environment.
I think it's amazing. I mean, stand back far enough from this. We've got the regulator, and I'm going to put words in your mouth here, I'm afraid, but we've got the FCA acting like a startup. We talk about minimum lovable products rather than minimal viable products, and there's a lot of things to love in this in terms of actually what it can do for the market. But I mean, that competition mandate and bringing competition to the marketplace, it's been something obviously since the changes in the mandate for a while. But how important is that to this? Because it does change that dynamic of the landscape in terms of it isn't just gigantic organizations who can use this, but equally they can. So how much has that been driving the decision making around doing this?
So clearly, I mean, we've talked about two of our really important, objectives around consumer protection and around competition. And I think, we see this as another stablemate of our offerings that are around supporting and enabling competition, and very much sitting alongside the Regulatory Sandbox, the advice unit, direct support, our regulatory hackathons, the tech sprints. This is another element that we see as building it out. And I think Nick Cook very, very well, our Director of Innovation, and I think he makes a very important point, which is, if you are not seeking to innovate and to continually challenge yourselves and respond to feedback and insight and reflection, then actually in this kind of space you have you can go backwards. Yeah. Standing still and not doing anything is really challenging, actually, and therefore seeking to reflect and listen to and understand the feedback, and then crucially the role that we can play as that sort of triangulates with our competition or our consumer protection remit, is the space at which we then say where's the space in which we can add value, create a proposition, create an environment which kind of greater fosters that sort of that competition.
Well, I imagine at this stage you're the sort of key roles that you keep hiring for is just probably hundreds of people reviewing all of the applications you're going to be getting, because the amount of the sheer volume of applications, like you say. I know in past with things like the regulatory sandboxes, you are, as you say, sort of really inundated with applications, but particularly this time, I think, given both of these things, I mean, you guys need a small army just reviewing them, don't you?
Well, I hope we get flooded with applications. I have to say, we have you've given me a very neat segue, and we haven't rehearsed this, but we have an advisory panel that is supporting us and working in partnership with us on interrogating the applications coming through, and they are very much aligned to those three use cases. So we have City of London Police, we have the NCA, we have colleagues at Citizens Advice, Step Change, we have Innovate Finance, CBI. So real subject matter expertise to align to those three use cases to help the FCA and City of London Corporation teams really kind of interrogate and understand kind of the proposition as it kind of pertains to the eligibility criteria, clearly, but also to the kind of challenges that we have scoped out. So hopefully it's going to be a joint endeavour, and the load is going to be spread across those three areas. But and I think that's another point around the collaboration. The advisory panel and the expertise they bring in really helping to reflect on, interrogate, review, be quite thoughtful, really, for us about how those propositions really meet need where need is. And I think, obviously a very clear example is around the consumer vulnerability space, but it is writ large across the other two use cases as well. And that kind of very tangible frontline experience is going to be profoundly valuable for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Like, say, the market, 7 cohorts into the regulatory sandbox. I'd probably hasten to guess that something that would have made it into cohort 1 probably wouldn't make it into cohort 7 because of the advancements of the thinking in the industry and the understanding. It wouldn't need that level of scrutiny from so it's understood. So it just feels like, again, this is an evolution, isn't it? It's continually evolving how we treat these things, how we think about them. But I guess, look, I know you. I mean, my kids are going to be bursting in the door anytime soon, and yours are as well. So we probably should wrap this up and move on. I guess the main question is, if our audience really wanted to find out more about it or submit their applications, as I'm sure they do, how could they do so? Where do they need to head for this?
www.digitalsandboxpilot.co.uk. That's digitalsandboxpilot.co.uk. And there's more information on our website, fca.org.uk, more information on City of London Corporation's website as well. Do your usual search engines searches for it. There is, or get in touch with me directly, or with members of the team, with members of my team as well. So there are lots of routes to come in. Please do express your interest, make an application, find out more. If you want to observe, you want to offer your mentoring services, whatever it might be. But yes, please do engage and spread the word and share your interest.
Fantastic. Well, really great initiatives. Fantastic to see it out there, and like I say, I'm sure the flood of responses, the flood of opportunities coming to you will be huge. But that's all we've got for you this week, I'm afraid, though, as we're sort of rapidly running out of time. But if you don't want to miss other shows that we're doing, we have another show from 11FS called Spotlight, which goes out live on Thursdays at 3:30 BST and 10:30 AM ET. So have a great week if you want to engage with that content. If you've enjoyed this, do let us know as well. I'm sure you have, but that's all we have for you today. Goodbye.